Well, good morning. I'd like to start this session this morning with a quote. So, the announcement the president just made is significant, I believe, because it contributes to the end of the days when women, at least half the talent pool in our society, appear in high places only one at a time. Does anyone know who said that? Ruth Bader Ginsburg, upon accepting the nomination to the Supreme Court in 1993. And I think it's telling. And this is one of my favorite sessions and one of my most frustrating sessions. And I lead it here and around the world wherever we do Milken Institute events because it's just year after year we tend to come together and talk about the same issue with relatively little movement. In 1993, I had finished grad school the year before. I had done a lot of work on gender in the workplace, which at the time was focused on mommy tracking and how people who were initial leaders in business, once they decided to have children, had their careers derail. But there wasn't the sense that this was going to be an equality type conversation, nor was it anticipated that 20 plus years later, as the video said, women would be the majority in the workforce, the majority in universities, and yet still treated as a minority in the country. I think it's important to understand the language that we use. Just last night, I was speaking with someone who actually works for Chris, but I won't say who it was, and very complimentary about Chris, and said, you know, it's just so wonderful. He's created such a diverse board, and there's been no dilution in the efficacy. And I think that while the intention was good, that presumptive language, that once you have diversity or women, that it somehow dilutes, that there's an expectation that the white male would be the presumptive person who is skilled and should get that job. And we tend to use language that ends up being, it hits our subconscious and then it perpetrates that stereotype. I think we tend to identify each other as what we're not, even in the government. When you think of reports that come out, non-farm payrolls. Non-farm payrolls is kind of a hangover from an agrarian society that no longer exists. But it's so much in the vernacular that we don't even think about it. But it is defining the otherness. When you're filling out a form on demography, it'll say, you know, white, black, other. I mean, the complexion of America is changing. There's an interesting article last year, Iman has a cosmetic line apparently, and the colors that were devised end up needing to change through the cosmetic industry because of the changing complexion of people in America. So this idea that there's even separate races over time will diminish. And my point on where this resides inside corporations, since this idea about equality and empowering women and getting them into senior roles, is that if I were to scan most corporations in America, this initiative is trapped in the HR department, in diversity initiatives, and it is not on the front line as a business imperative. And yet the economic story of where this growth should come, the engine that women drive, were they to be fully realized inside the corporation, I think is a missed opportunity. So I first want to turn to Rosie, because I know that some of that is what you focus on, the business imperative and understanding the economic impact for women. So why don't you talk about kind of the parity issue?
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. So I'm Rosie Rios, Treasurer of the United States. I've been in the administration now since the very beginning. In fact, as part of the Treasury Federal Reserve transition team, right after the election of November of 2008, I was one of 23 finance professionals who were brought in to implement what is now known as the Troubled Asset Relief Program. So for me, I kind of consider myself an accidental feminist. I had no interest in these issues whatsoever. Moving from California to D.C., it's kind of a different country, quite frankly. And I was the first woman confirmed in Treasury. In fact, I was the only woman confirmed in Treasury in all of 2009, in one of the most consequential times of our economic history. So for me, it's really not just about gender. It's about economic empowerment. And so the initiatives that I've started have really tried to focus more on what are the economic benefits of parity, or even just a recognition that the issue even exists, quite frankly. You may have heard about one of my initiatives that I've been working on now for almost 8 years, which is putting a woman on our currency. So we finally made that announcement last week. Yes, thank you. Thank you. But obviously, it's more than just currency redesign. It is, again, kind of a first step of a larger conversation. It wasn't about one woman or 10 women. It's about the hundreds of women who have been omitted from our history records. And so, again, trying to get beyond what was announced last week and continuing the conversation at our dinner tables, at our schools, at our communities. But for me, what I've tried to do specifically in Treasury is to focus on, again, some of the issues that really demonstrate where some of these substantive changes can be made. And so if you think about it, Treasury has a division called our Office of Economic Policy, and so we try really, really hard to think about not just what unemployment means, what the unemployment rate looks like. So obviously you might know that it's now one of its lowest levels at 5%, but what's behind the unemployment rate? So the Federal Reserve uses the unemployment rate as a way to determine whether or not we should be raising interest rates. Before, in the past, it was really, again, what that percentage looked like. Now there's over 25 different indicators of what the unemployment rate looks like. Everything from, again, workforce participation, shadow unemployment, income levels, productivity, all kinds of ways that we should be thinking about where you can make those changes. What I am most thrilled about lately is McKinsey's gender parity report, which I know people are going to hear a little bit more after this session in a private reception. But when I first read about it, they actually came to do a presentation to me on their initial findings, and I just thought it was great. I had asked them to share some of that information before it was officially launched at our annual Women in Finance Symposium. This is something that I started in 2010, and our Women in Finance Symposium has different themes every year, but it was never really supposed to talk about gender. We never really talk about gender. We talk about issues in the economy, issues in business, issues in finance, and they happen to be extraordinary women at the table. But this report I thought was so significant because it really broke down what the economic benefits are if we were to really focus on 3 specific areas, which includes workforce participation, the number of hours that women work, and also the industries and sectors that they focus on in terms of productivity levels. So for me, that type of information, where it's data-driven, where you could really kind of drill down to think about where we can make changes at the local level, the state level, and the federal level, to me, make all the difference in the world.
Mm-hmm. And I want to just make a point about the government. The U.S. Senate building did not have a ladies' room on the floor until 1993. And even worse in the House, in 2011, when there were 76 female House of Representatives members, was when they got a ladies' room, because these buildings were constructed at a time that they weren't expecting women to come. And it took a very long time. 76 people used to have to traverse clear across Congress to use the facilities. So I think, and then the other point I want to make is, when Paul Ryan recently was entertaining taking the speakership of the House, he made a statement that said, "I cannot and will not give up my family time." And I thought for a moment, would a woman have said that? Like, would that be something that today a woman would feel comfortable enough saying in front of America to talk? And Candy, you have had experience both inside the government and now at Citi, a major corporation. Could you contrast for us a little bit, one, the evolution of this as a subject matter from when you were in the government, and are there differences in the way the government views gender, women, and diversity issues versus a corporation like Citi?
Well, I was on the Hill in 1993 as the bathroom issue was evolving. So it was interesting to be there and see some of the members and in the Senate, actually, at the time. I made a couple calls and called some of the staff, the 22, 23, 24-year-olds that are up on the Hill today, and was sort of inquiring, having left the Hill a while back, to make sure that I sort of understood where things, are today versus when I was even up there. And it hasn't evolved a lot. I think the challenges, as I see it, is that we spend a lot of time in the private sector focusing, and have been focusing on the gender gap, the gender issues. Yet the public sector, whether it's at the state level, and others here can speak to it in their service, but at the federal level, where while the Congress focuses on the policies, pay parity, there's proposals out there, they're not focused on the personnel. So there really isn't the networking opportunities. There really isn't the top-down and the efforts that the private sector has taken on. Whether we criticize the efforts and think we've gone far enough or more needs to be done, there's been effort. You translate that and you look to the government and you say you've got this whole population of people that are working in government, whether in civil service and retiring in that job, or whether they're coming in as kids working on Capitol Hill and deciding they're going to go on to something else. We haven't built the networking. They haven't promoted it. The members focus perhaps on the policies, but they don't actually look at their own offices. And unless you have someone who's a chief of staff that mentors a person or brings them along, you really don't see the activity. And when you talk to the staff about it, and I say, well, who's mentoring you? Well, I have a good chief of staff if they're a female, and then they talk about it. You know, who's helping you think about what your next steps are? Well, no one. Is there a group you can meet with? Well, occasionally we get together. You know, so I think there's some obvious holes. It's interesting as we talk to the policymakers who are focused on what are the policies that we think we need to promote at the local, state, and federal level, and yet they haven't looked internally, and that's always been the criticism, certainly with Congress, which is they don't have to apply the employment laws to themselves. And so there's been that continued progress and process to sort of get the members and to get the policymakers to look internally and look at their own structure and look at the staff, whether they're at the committee level or whether they're in the federal government and the administration, around how you actually manage that process. So I think there's more work to be done. And I would throw out, I think the interesting question is going to be in the election, which if we know that this is going to be a gender election in some capacity, whether it's Donald Trump and the anti-woman or Hillary Clinton as the woman, and where is that going to take this conversation, and where will it potentially change some of the issues going into government? If Hillary Clinton were elected, how does this sort of push down, and are there policies that can be implemented and pushed forward into the government level as a consequence of having a female at the top for the first time?
Okay.
So more to come.
Yeah.
Right.
I just have to add,
Sure.
every congressional office makes its own rules
Oh, yeah.
about things like maternity leave, which is totally unbelievable. So women staffers on the Hill actually all sort of talk amongst themselves, like who's a good member to actually work for if you're planning on having a kid. It's totally unreal. Like it's stuff that would never be acceptable in the private sector.
Yeah. Let's stay on that for a moment, because I think that maternity leave is an interesting topic. Should we still be talking about this as more of a woman's issue as opposed to a parenting issue? Right? Are men, when you see the surveys of men, especially people that are millennial men, are saying that they too want a work-life balance. They too want to spend time with their children as they're growing. If we change the language of that conversation to parenthood, does it change? Should Working Mother magazine still be titled Working Mother, or does that further that otherness, that it's such an aberration that you need your own magazine to help you?
Well, in fairness, they're not doing very well. So I don't know how much longer that magazine's actually going to be around. I think they're actually not in print anymore. But anyway.
Online, yeah.
They're online only. So I'm Lauren Leader-Chivet. I run something called All In Together, which is a women's political leadership organization. And I also work on diversity issues with Fortune 500 companies. I have a book coming out on this in a few months. So I get frustrated. So I've been researching and looking at these issues for a long time and working with big companies and now also working with the government on these issues. I definitely get tense when the leave conversation comes up relative to talking about sort of how are women doing. I actually got into working on women's issues because of the leave issues. I went to Washington to lobby around expanding the FMLA because I was head of HR and had to write another maternity leave policy, which entailed a long, protracted battle with my male bosses who didn't understand why we needed to give leave, and that made me crazy. So I went to Washington to try to fix that, and many years later, that is still the same scenario. But I cringe, even though I do believe it's an important issue, I cringe because it really isn't the most central issue in terms of what's happening in the advancement and retention and success of women in the private sector. It is just not the most important factor. Does it matter? Is it important? 100%. But what we know is that a huge percentage, and I'll tell you the numbers in a second, but a huge percentage of professional women in the pipeline to top jobs in corporate America do not have children. The number is actually 42% of professional, college-educated working women at age 40 in American companies do not have children. That number is actually 60% in the United Kingdom, and that number is 50% plus in about 15 countries around the world. So that is not to discount that caregiving is not an issue, but when you look at really what's happening in terms of the advancement of women in those senior-most levels, you cannot explain the gap in advancement on children or on stepping out of the workforce. And even among women who do have children, it is a very, cities like New York and LA, we get a skewed view of this because we spend a lot of time in very wealthy milieus. But the reality is that the data doesn't reflect that there is massive numbers of women leaving the workforce for that reason. They sometimes say that's why they're stepping out. It's easier to say I want to be home with my toddler than you've just passed me over for a promotion again, and nobody's giving me a good reason for it. So I think that topic winds up being skewed. Does it matter? Yes. But I would love for just generally the conversation around women's leadership and equality to be somewhat less about that and kind of more about some of the other, very important topics, which are, around CEO and leader engagement. And you talked about that at the beginning. I do think that's starting to change, that we're seeing much more business-centric executive focus on closing the gender gap as a business strategy. It's not just the McKinsey study. The Peterson Institute just did a big study on the impact of gender balance on financial performance. Credit Suisse has done this. So it's even this whole topic is like moving out of the typical, sort of HR studies and even like the McKinsey studies, and now big think tanks. Sorry, Milken, I probably shouldn't mention the Peterson Institute while I'm in this building. I might like some kind of trapdoor. But, it is an important development that now like big economic think tanks are starting to look at these issues and take them seriously. And that is affecting how CEOs think about these issues.
Okay. So, Chris, I want to turn to you because you run a very large pool of capital, and you have been at the forefront of this issue, actually going so far as to design an ETF called SHE. So I want you to speak about that as a screen, the fact that, as Sally mentioned in the tape, that when women are on boards, with diverse boards generally, that diversity of thought leads to lower risk, higher performance, greater retention, those types of things which make a company more profitable in the long run. Tell us how you as an investor think about this issue.
Well, and I want to build off of what you said. It's time to go beyond talk. I've been on this panel 3 times.
Yep.
And every time we've talked about it, but the issue has not improved. Frankly, it's gotten worse at the senior levels. So for us, we've worked with State Street to put out there the hashtag Beyond Talk, because it's time to stop talking and time to move and see some action. And to us, the key is for women in senior leadership to network together so that when a woman climbs the ladder, the first thing she does is put her hand back down and pull somebody up with her. So there's that collaboration. And so State Street created the index. I have to say we didn't do it. We might have inspired it. One of the ladies on my staff came up with a stock symbol, cleverly saying, hey, is SHE taken? So there's a SHE ETF, and there's a gender balance index. And the index focuses in on the top 1,000 companies in America. And it really looks at a company if 30% of their senior leadership is female, and they either have a woman CEO or women on the board. And what you find when you look at that is those companies do outperform the marketplace. And they make, in my view, they make better decisions. They get more input into the decisions. It's not groupthink. It's not just a bunch of white male men sitting together. And part of my tease question is, I'm different than everybody else on the panel, and it's not what you think. I don't have to buy shampoo.
So lucky.
Or cream rinse. But you're stuck too often in corporate America with groupthink. White males, all from the same types of universities thinking together. And so for us as a long-term shareholder, we're $185 billion. We own companies for as much as 30 and 40 years. We want to see more of a mix in the boardroom. We want to see more of a mix in senior leadership because they make better decisions. In my view, I don't know if it's going to always outperform, but I really believe in my heart that what you're going to see is those companies take less risk, and so that index will actually have a lower risk profile, but get you the same return as the market. And in my business, more return or same return at a lower risk is a darn good thing. So we're putting our money where our mouth is. We're trying to go beyond talk and move this forward to actually make companies, and working with State Street to not only reward the companies that are in the index, but really to shame the companies that are not, because they're not tapping into, as you've all said, 50% of the IQ power of the world. And that's an incredible resource in senior leadership, and there is that blockade. So colleges are incredibly diverse. Over 50% of the university graduates are female. And as you said, at the start of the workforce, very diverse. But then it's not up in the senior leadership, and that's where the companies have to focus to intentionally pull ladies up and give them the opportunities to advance, to stretch. And one of the things we looked at with the Clayman Institute at Stanford, it's the language that even men and women use. So even a woman CEO or a woman leader will describe a woman as being collaborative, supportive, the type of language that actually has a bias against somebody in leadership because they're looking for somebody who's a go-getter or a driver. And just instinctively, or probably socially, we're trained to use different words for the different genders. And we think that women need to study that and men need to study that to understand how to be more neutral in the way they describe leadership and those skills because they're present in both groups.
So the study that Lauren mentioned from Credit Suisse actually found that when women were on the boards of financial firms before the crisis, there was less risk on the balance sheet, and those firms tended to fare better. But another thing that you mentioned is when people drop out of the workforce. So when women drop out and then start an entrepreneurial path because the corporation doesn't receive them as well, Mike Milken tells a story that in 1985, he financed a woman for the first time that hadn't inherited a business from her husband or parents, and was shocked that he received a large amount of hate mail from random people that had nothing to do with the situation about why are you doing that? Like, this is a disproportionate risk that you're taking. And this was 1985. So fast forward 30 years, Alex, I want to go to you as someone who has actually been through the process of raising capital in the incubator. Tell us the story about the women lens on what you're trying to do.
Absolutely. So I'm Alex Kavalakis. I'm one of the founders of themuse.com startup. We founded out of New York about 4 years ago. We help about 50 million millennials a year with their careers and help connect them with top companies.
Is her mic on, please?
Yeah, pull it
up a little bit. Is that better? There you go. So we've raised over $12 million so far. We'll likely raise more capital this year, given the interest of the market, which has been great for us. But what's been interesting to me, so we started the business in New York. We moved out to Silicon Valley to go through Y Combinator, the accelerator program out there. And the landscape in tech. So I started my career at McKinsey, and I worked for financial services clients. So I'd seen what most people would assume is one of the extremes when it looks to, look at the gender gap, especially at the top. And moving into tech, the ratios got worse. And what's interesting to me is people look at technology and they look at entrepreneurship as the future of this is what's going to solve everything. This is the meritocracy that's going to change the gender gap. And the ratios were worse. The investors were just as male, if not more so, than in finance. The other founders, especially those who got early capital based on an idea alone, on potential alone, tended to be male. And so the experience of going through that was much more jarring than working for financial services firms or in consulting, which was not what we were expecting. And what we found interesting is that as we progressed, and as we had more and more traction, so we gained in terms of both revenue and users, that is where we started to be taken much more seriously. And we'd have a lot of conversations with male founders that were in similar stages as us, and ask them, how do you respond to questions like, are you really in it for the long haul? And they're like, we never get asked that question. But we kept being like, how do you respond to questions around, do you have what it takes to run a company that might one day want to go public? And like, no one asks us that. There's an assumption of competence, especially for white men, and they're evaluated, and there's research on it, evaluated based on their potential, where they could go, whereas they look at historical performance when it comes to women, and even when it came to diligence documents for early fundraising, we had to jump through so many more hoops than our male counterparts, just to make sure that we knew what we were doing. So it was fascinating. And the veiled questions, especially from investors in our early stages around, well, when you get older, are you sure you still want to be running this? And we had to legitimately say, are you asking me if I want to have kids and how that will impact how I run this business? And have you ever asked a male entrepreneur the same question? So it's been interesting to see the gap perpetuated, unfortunately.
The difference, yeah. So, I have 2 children. I used to run a bank. I have 2 million frequent flyer miles.
Yeah.
No one ever asked me how I managed to hold it all together.
Right?
Right? But that's a typical question. That
And I
people...
don't have children, but I get asked it all the time.
Yeah. Right. So I want to stay in finance and go across the pond to Janet. So presumably the European press that we see here. There are countries there that actually have legislatively mandated women on boards, et cetera. But give us the view from the UK, because inside financial services, this issue is quite acute still on women being underrepresented in the senior most levels of management. So give us the perspective from the UK, both in the finance industry and generally.
Yes, so I'm Janet Thomas, President of Women in Banking and Finance. And Women in Banking and Finance has been, it's a voluntary organisation that's been running for over 30 years. And we work very closely with all the major financial companies in the UK. So, for example, Citigroup are a client of ours, Bank of America, then we have Barclays and so on. In the UK, I was just saying to Richard earlier that I think it's come to a point now where there's a real frustration that not enough has happened. And so, although I've been involved in gender diversity for quite some time, about 15 years, I think that in the last 12 months, I've seen some real developments that I've never, ever seen before in the finance industry. And I think I should just cut to chase and get to those developments. So I became president of Women in Banking and Finance 2 years ago. And what I decided as president was that enough is enough. We need to be, all the women groups, because there's many of them in the UK, and I think in London we have about 2,000. We need to be more collaborative. It's a nonsense to have one group doing one thing and another group doing nothing. You might as well join forces, and together as a group, you have a much louder voice. So in talking to the women that I've grown up with, either in Wall Street or in the city, and collaborating much more effectively, we were able to have much more of a powerful voice with the government and also with our friends in the media. From that collaboration, although slightly informal in the beginning, what we had last year, which was published this year, was that Nikki Morgan, who is the Minister for Women and Equalities, her secretary for the Treasury worked with 3,500 of us in finance, all the special groups, all the groups up and down the country, not just in London. And they got our ideas on why is it that we are not making progress? What's going wrong? So we shared all the stories from our members. We shared the stories such as, I went in and told my manager that I need to take X months of maternity, and the next thing I knew, I got the sack. We shared the story about the women who raised issues in work, and then they had their promotion capped. So we shared the real horror stories with the Treasury, and we also share the things that have worked quite well. In my position, I'm very privileged because I have very close and confidential conversations with the CEOs of the major financial institutions in the UK, and they are engaged. There's no doubt they are engaged. But what they say to me is, we're wrestling with this issue of moving the needle. What works? What practices have you seen, Janet, that work well? So we shared those stories with the Treasury. In March this year, the Treasury published a report, and that report is essentially says, what gets measured gets done. And this is what came out of the report. Mm-hmm. All companies operating in finance in the UK, the government's given them an opportunity to sign up to a charter. In that charter, they have to measure everything. They have to, in their accounts, they have to report women on the board, women in executive leadership positions, women in the pipeline for executive leadership positions, women in the mid-track of their career, women who have been promoted, and women coming in at the entry point. There are measures for every stage of a woman's career. That's one part. The second part, they are asking senior executives, doesn't have to be the CEO, because we recognize that some financial institutions and banks, their organizational structure is quite complicated, is quite complex. So what the government's asking, or the Treasury's asking, is that a senior executive, not HR, and preferably not a woman, but a senior executive male in a P&L function to be responsible for a 3 to 5 year diversity plan and to report targets in their company accounts on an annual basis. So that they are to report performance in that given year and what adjustments need to be made to achieve their targets in the following year. And then the third recommendation is a real focus on culture. And I think that's the part that's quite tricky in financial services. And they're asking for the executives in finance companies to come forward with some recommendations. So essentially, that's been a real game changer for us. And I think that that's been successful. It is early days. The banks are given the opportunity to sign up to Charter, and a number of banks have already signed up, such as Barclays, such as Lloyds, and so on. And I think more banks will sign up. And we will effectively talk and lobby our partners or our members to work with them to sign up. And I was also sharing with Richard, just before we stepped onto the stage this morning, that something historic has happened in the UK. It's going to take place on the 5th of May. For the first time in British history, I think because of the sheer frustration and the slow pace of change for women in the UK, there's a Women Equalities Party, and women are going to have been given the opportunity to go to the polls on the 5th of May when they vote in the mayor's election to also vote for the Women's Party. And the reason why that's come about, I mean, again, it's organisations like Women in Banking and Finance collaborating with others, talking to our friends, asking what else can we do. So it's not just about going to the government. We need a much stronger mouthpiece. And what the Women's Equality Party will do, providing we can get sufficient votes, that will have a massive impact on the Labour Party and the Conservative Party in driving forward policy. So the areas that we're looking at is definitely women in business, women in politics, women in media. And despite all the nonsense that we hear in the press about equal pay, is it really, are the figures right, are they not right, and being questioned, there is an equal pay issue, and we want it addressed. And that is probably the number one item on the agenda. So
you know, the UK has a unique dimension here, which I have to point out, because there are some ways in which the UK, as frustrated as they are, have actually made more progress than the United States, and there's a very specific reason for it. So the UK now no longer has a single company without a woman on the board. There was a massive transformation over the last 18 months. They've dramatically increased the percentage of women on UK boards in a very short period of time. And the thing that's different about the UK than the United States, which is part of why I do what I do, is that in the UK, there is a relationship between the government's engagement on diversity issues and what happens in the private sector. Now, you can argue about whether one country is more successful or not, but the reality is that you have an entire system in the UK, which includes the government, that is driving a national focus on diversity. It is front page news in the financial papers and in the everyday papers in the UK. Every single day there is a story about some dimension of diversity in the FT, in the London Times. And that is in part because the Cameron government and others have shined a light on this, starting with the Davis Commission a few years ago. In the US, we have such a gaping divide between what we do in government and how we think about representation and diversity in government and what we do in the private sector. And if you think about it, we have all these conversations about gender diversity, and how many have you all been to? 100? We've all been to hundreds of these. When was the last time that somebody brought up the topic of women's political leadership or the representation of women in government in one of those conversations? Like never. It doesn't come up. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about it in the business context. Well, why? I mean, we have fabulous women like Rosie who were in the private sector, who transitioned into the public sector, and look at the impact that she's had. We need more of this. And as long as we are treating these like separate issues, they're not. And my hope is that I actually think that this election may bring this to a head in a big way. Because, again, whatever your political affiliation, and this is, I run a nonpartisan organization. We have lots of Republicans and lots of Democrats that work with us. The thing that they have in common, that women have in common no matter what party they're in, is this passion and desire to see women be successful, to have equal opportunity, to have equal access, to have equal voice. That is not a partisan issue, but it's about to be one. It's about to be one in a big way.
Well, it is now.
And it is already,
Yep.
right? So I think, you know, these are the moments. Like, this is a moment for the United States. Are we going to seize it? Are we going to actually use this moment to say, you know, with a really loud voice, you know, that there are things, values that we all share as women, which is we all believe we should have equal voice, equal access, equal opportunity, equal representation. You know, are we going to let this moment go? And I hope we will not let this moment go, because I think it's a critical one.
But I do think that the catalyst behind the women's gender being placed firmly in the spotlight for the government is because of the financial crisis. Our finance industry, I think, has been hit and affected because of the financial crisis. I'm in foreign exchange. I've been in foreign exchange for a very long time. If you look at my own industry, it's a $5.3 trillion market on a daily basis. London, 40% of that 5.3 trillion passes through London. The FX industry was hit really hard because of manipulation. London will lose some of that business. And it has to work really hard now to build back its credibility. So if you've got women making up 50% of the workforce in the financial services, which accounts for 7% of the total working population in the UK, it is a very obvious place to start, particularly if those women are working well below their capability. The Treasury published that by 2030, the contribution to GDP will be in the region of 10%. So for me, the economic case has been proven. We just need to get on with it now. Mm-hmm. We really, really do. And it's an obvious place to start.
I think something interesting that you said before was one of the metrics that are going to be evaluated is who's in the pipeline.
Yes.
You can't act surprised that there's no one in the C-suite if you haven't put the work into developing the pipeline of potential. So I want to talk about that for a moment. I want to shift to the idea of sponsors and mentors. And I think that there's some noise in the system that women aren't particularly good mentors for junior women, et cetera. And I think we need to change that lens to think, well, why can only a woman be a mentor to another woman? You know, in fact, in my own career, I've had several women, both that I've worked for and have worked for me, who have been mentors in very different ways. And so I want to open up that. Candy, who's been your mentor or sponsor?
Well, in my career, I was the first woman to ever hold the position of head of legislative affairs at the White House, and thankfully President Obama put in another woman a few years back. But
So
that
stop
meant
you there. I want to call your language. You don't have to be grateful that
Yeah.
President Obama put another woman in, right?
Very good point.
The thankful part is what I talked about in the beginning about the language that we use, right?
But we're, in that environment,
Yeah.
there were not a lot of women who were going to be mentoring me in any of the capacity, particularly, I'm a lobbyist, right? So at the end of the day, that's a really bad word. It goes with the lawyer, the lobbyist, the rest of it. I'm in that career. And it was very male-dominated, just like finance is and has been. And so you end up in a position where I look around and have had mentors that have been men, and that's really because there weren't a lot of women to look to. In my role now, where I've got a team and I bring people along, I try to do both. I mean, I think it's helpful for women to do it, but it's also helpful to have men in the capacities and in the areas in which we're working. And it's got to be a collaboration, and it's got to be an involvement by both. Because if it's just going to be women pulling women up, I think we're not going to get there. If you've got
women at the top,
there aren't enough to do it. And so the numbers don't work until the pyramid changes, right? And so we got to get the change going on. And so it's got to be broader, and there's got to be involvement at all levels. And I think that's particularly true in the government level when you look at it and you say, we have the same pyramid problem. Right? There just aren't enough senior people in the government levels or even in the corporations that are going to be able to do it. So.
Yeah,
Okay, Alex,
absolutely. No, and I think what's been interesting is, and it's both through research and sort of, if a woman tapped a woman to come join their team, there is always a chance that people ask why she was chosen, right? And when there's only so many women in power and a huge number of people who may possibly be a good second in command, be someone you can groom, you need both men and women to be taking a look at the talent that they have in front of them and looking at them just the same as a woman would look at that talent. I think it's ever more powerful when it sometimes comes from a man saying, this person is great and I'm going to groom them. I think the choice of mentor versus sponsor is also an important one. I think I've had a lot of great female mentors who have been in my shoes. Also male mentors who've been in my shoes in different ways. For example, when we talk about fundraising, there are only so many women we can talk to who have been in our shoes. There are a lot of men we also had to talk to and see how they handled the same situation, but it was different. In terms of sponsorship, they don't need to have been in my shoes to say, I want to help this person be successful. I want to help introduce them to someone. I want to help tell someone how great they are who might not have heard of them, bring them into a meeting. I mean, those things don't require you having ever had the same experience. It just requires you believing in someone and wanting to help them move up the ladder. I think you're right. I mean, in terms of the pyramid, the math does not add up in terms of the number of women who want to be mentored by senior women and the number of senior women left over.
Can I just also mention, so there's a big difference between mentors and sponsors and champions.
Yeah.
So my approach has always been on the champion role. You really have to be very, very deliberate. I call myself kind of a constructive disruptor. I do my homework first and foremost, and it's a very, very specific agenda, very, very specific. And then you need to find those champions, male or female, although in my case, for the last 15 years, they've been male champions, and you need to personalize it in a way that makes sense, but you still have to get to the bottom line, an actionable item. It has to be actionable. This isn't just an arm around the shoulder. This is stating your case, and the way I've been trained in due diligence is very, very specific, very, very deliberate. Existing conditions, precedent, case study, analysis, recommendation, implementation, done. And there's a very, very specific path to get there. So whether it was, look, Treasury our building was built in 1800, and we had no nursing lounge. It made no sense to me, none. So again, kind of getting to that kind of project management-based discussion and getting to the point where your recommendation, there's no reason to say no. Getting them to yes is so specific.
How did you find your mentors? I think some of that is, I want a mentor, but I don't know how to start. My champions.
My champions.
How did you find them?
I went straight to the top. So it was Secretary Geithner. Secretary Geithner, who is the one who approved my currency concept in 2012. And I think a big part of why he approved it is I went through the mindset of how currency redesign happens. Security first and foremost, but aesthetics, and under this rubric of the theme of democracy, which spans all our notes, not just the 10, the 5, and the 20. And again, getting him to the point where if the theme is democracy and knowing we're working towards this 2020 milestone, 2020 happens to be the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote. So again, getting to this kind of, this is the history of how currency design happens, this is why democracy was chosen, here's why democracy could be represented in our notes, male or female. It just happened to be, again, how we chose it was through this democratic process of public engagement and input, public input. But I can think of many examples like that. For example, in our capital purchase program, as part of the Troubled Asset Relief Program, we had provisions that were placed in there as part of the legislation for the original stimulus, the original Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, that said that if financial institutions who were receiving capital missed certain milestones, that Treasury had the ability to appoint people to the board of directors. Fabulous. So I went to Herb Allison, and I went to Tim Massid, who is here, and I specifically said to him, look, I have this great database of folks who should be considered. Take a look at their resumes, interview them. I don't care how you end up managing this process, but you got to interview them and give it a fair shot. We ended up having, of the 20 board positions that we had access to, 6 of them were women. Now, I am probably going to assume that's probably 6 more than what we would have had. But again, it takes that very, very deliberate approach, seeing where one person or 10 people can make a difference, owning it, finding those champions, and making it a case that you would make a case for any other project on how it could make sense.
Yeah.
I think
So
that, I know
sorry.
that's true. I will just say that it does sometimes happen, though, that male leaders, the second it becomes anything that has to touch or has to do with gender, will immediately then defer you to a woman on their team who they think is going to help you more effectively. And this happens to me all the time. So I run an organization that's focused on creating better democracy and a more representative democracy. And we know that when women get into office, they're actually more bipartisan and more productive. And so if you believe that who here thinks Congress could be better functioning? No one? Oh, okay. So if you actually think that Congress could function better, the most important thing you can do is elect women to congressional office. But disproportionately, women candidates don't get the same funding. And part of the reason is that men think that women should be funding women candidates, and there aren't enough women to do it. And so they face this double jeopardy. And the same thing happens with organizations like mine that are trying to do anything around that has a gender topic on it. You know, really fantastic, well-intentioned, amazing men who support all kinds of things similar to ours the second we say we're focused on women. And this includes foundations, by the way. They want to work on democracy, but as soon as you mention we're going to focus on women in democracy, then they want to send you to somebody else that specializes in the women thing.
Well, that goes back to where does this housed inside the organization?
Yeah, so
if it's in the
we
diversity
do need
department.
we need more, we need organizations like CalSTRS, and we need more male leaders who will not defer this constantly to the women on their team, but are willing to actually really take this on, because we know how good it is for our economy, it's so good for our companies, it's so good for our democracy. I mean, the case is in, right? Now we just need, to your point, we need people to step up and own it. Right. And that has to happen at every level in every sector.
And I think the case is in, but if I look around the room, there's still a lot more women here, and you don't need to convince yourselves, right? We need to engage men, and how to do that is the challenge. I think there's been this notion that you go through men and say, well, you have a daughter, and you have a spouse, and maybe they would have, but I also have a son, and I want him to also think in a gender-neutral way and not be thinking of things by label. So Chris, inside CalSTRS, in addition to this huge pool of capital that you manage an organization. I mean, tell us, how do the men fit into this discussion?
I think it's a matter of just like you said, it's going beyond talk. It's taking action. So we have 140 investment professionals on staff. We're exactly 50-50 split gender balance, and in fact, when you look at our senior leadership, it tilts more toward women. But it's a matter of being intentional. So it's interesting to hear you talk. I was part of a panel with a headhunter, my deputy CIO, who's a woman, and myself. So I'm the only man on the interview panel. And the headhunter brought me a list of candidates, all male. And I said, okay, go back. I want you to search extra hard because I want to see at least 50-50 gender balance in this mix. And sure enough, finally, after all that extra work, she came back. And I thought it was interesting. Both the women pushed back on me. No, these are the best candidates. I'm like, no, we've got to look harder. Just that, being intentional about that. In the end, it was the 2 women out of 4 that were actually the top 2 candidates. Mm-hmm. And so I think it was a matter of that extra push and that extra effort. And we've started a mentoring program, about 50% of the staff. And you're making me think, because of being government, I wanted to make sure that we match gender with gender. So the men with the men and the women with the women. But you're right. Maybe we should, our HR shop will get nervous, but maybe we need to break that up a bit and definitely make sure that we're offering up that senior leadership to everybody and giving people an opportunity to advance.
I want to move to age, and I want to talk to you about this. So I think that do millennial women feel the same way entering the workforce today? Is there more of an expectation of a level playing field than there might have been when someone my age entered the workforce?
It's a great question. I won't pretend to speak for all millennial women,
Speak for all millennials.
but I will try.
Yeah.
I'll speak for myself, but also, I do have conversations with plenty of millennial women. I think one of the things that was most interesting to me, so I would consider myself an accidental feminist as well, in the sense that I went to college where it was a pretty even split. I worked hard. I did well. I got into, my experience felt, for the most part, like my gender didn't matter. And then I started working. And immediately, and I remember when I was being recruited to work at McKinsey, they did sort of women McKinsey events, and I was sort of like, why are they doing these separate events to recruit us? Like, I felt almost very angry that this needed to exist. And then I joined, I was like, now I understand why it exists. It's not for us while we're being recruited, it's for once we're there, because the experience still isn't quite there. So I think what's perhaps for different generations, they might have come in expecting the difference. I think what's actually almost harder for a lot of the millennial generation is that they grew up in an educational system where, for the most part, they were the majority, they did better, they worked hard, they were rewarded, and then they expected the world to continue to work that way and say, if I work hard, I will get rewarded. And that's not how work is currently structured. It's much more than the quality of what you do. It's the people you know, it's the expectations they have of where you might go, and I think that is where this issue is really gotten much more personal for women, is when they, in their first couple of years, maybe the first time they get promoted or they get passed up for a promotion where they didn't realize they had to speak up. It's like, I worked hard. I'm expecting my A now, and that's not how it works. And so I think that's where the challenge has been and continues to be.
And Lauren,
Rich,
when you think about...
let me jump in. I really like it's been thinking about the Secretary's comment of champions. We need to move beyond mentor and mentee or mentor and protege and really identify the people that will be champions for this issue within corporations, within government, and somehow create that network, get that out there.
And it's both champions for the issue and I think champions for individuals.
Agreed.
If you find a young woman who's incredibly talented, she will not by herself end up leading the organization. Because men by themselves don't end up leading the organization. You spoke about the HR sort of worrying about it. Something that was really interesting, especially working in finance and consulting early in my career, is that a lot of men of my age or in the same sort of level as me would get whiskey with a partner at 11 o'clock after we had a long day of work, in a way that, for similar reasons, does not happen with female associates, analysts, or managers.
Right.
Are those relationships then, they have to be related to then a year later who gets promoted? It's who you know, you feel comfortable, they're such a good guy. I mean, there's all these different elements. And I think that has to be part of the conversation.
It's a big part of it, but it also, I want to go back to language again, because when the sports analogy comes into the conversation, and oftentimes if women either don't understand or don't participate or what, you need to call people out on it, but there's a hesitancy. I can think of times on Margaret Anderson here is a colleague. She has no idea what I'm talking about sometimes. But there's a hesitancy for women to speak up and say, I don't understand that metaphor. I don't, because you want to feel like you do. But it's also, I can count on one hand the times that a woman has come to me and asked for a raise or asked for a promotion. But men have no problem telling you how great they are.
But the research shows that women are liked less when they do it, whereas men are rewarded for doing it. It's double jeopardy. So it's not just a question of, I think historically, a lot of the people thought it's just that women were socialized not to ask, but they're actually penalized for asking.
I mean, this is why Lean In so many ways is so controversial, and why, maybe many young women related to it, many older women said, like, come on, because we know that it is not as simple as just asking. It is more complicated than that. And, look, everywhere where you see real progress, and we have some great examples on the stage, everywhere where you see real progress, it requires that the people in the positions of power take the lead on these issues. And there's no reward. There's no reward for women, for people of color, for anyone who's in the minority, to be constantly the voice calling out the problems with the system.
Okay, now I need to call you out on your language. Women are not the minority, right? It's
well,
in
they're
the minority is not.
In the top,
in
the spheres in
right.
which we're describing. No, of course they're not. I mean, look, on the other side of it, part of what I've been now that I've been, I've done all this corporate work, I'm now kind of shifting some of my focus to the political world. I mean, the election is another good example of this. So women have turned. So you probably, I'll ask you to put up your hands if you know this afterwards. Women have turned every election in this country since 1980. Did you know that? We turn every election since 1980. You want to know what demographic group in the United States is the most likely to turn up at the polls and vote? Take a guess.
White males.
Women?
Black women. Black women are registered to vote at a higher rate than any other group in the country, and they actually show up to the polls and vote at a higher rate than any other group. You would never know this from the current coverage of the campaigns. And so,
But in your knowledge of the campaigns, is it surprising to you that Hillary is not resonating with millennial women?
Well, so first of all, I think we're too diverse to make a generalization about we're all supposed to agree on the same thing or vote for the same people. And I think this has been a problem that both parties have made. We're 60% of the population. We're not going to all agree, and that's not a reflection on her being some failure among women. It's a reflection of the fact that we are different and that we don't all agree. And by the way, there's plenty of conservative women, who are not voting Democrat, right? And that doesn't make them less feminist, right? And we have a tendency to think that we're all supposed to agree and we're all supposed to vote the same way, and that's really unfair. So I do think in the current climate that if the sort of rhetoric and the attacks on women continue to be, and I think frankly we've actually already heard enough for it to be a pretty decisive issue for a lot of women, you may see people making choices they haven't made before because this issue of being treated with respect and recognizing our role in society and recognizing really where are we today in 2016, I think may start to trump other things. But we're never going to all agree. Oh God, find another word.
Can I just follow up on that? So when I was talking about champions, I wasn't just talking about internal champions. You have to have external champions. I am not the biggest fan of the media at the moment, in my opinion. and so I really do think that there has to be a more concerted effort to get our messaging straight. It is not a one-size-fits-all. It can't be a one-size-fits-all. But there are certain issues where we do have these common underlying interests that I think need to be taken to that next level. I think, again, for me, I've been very fortunate. I've had my champions who have been extremely, extremely cooperative. But there's a price that you pay. There's a huge price that one pays to be that sole voice. But I do think that leadership is very, very individual, and it has to start within the individual.
What's the price? What's the price?
Oh, God. You probably have media here. I probably can't talk about it. But again, look, the benefits were definitely worth it by far, and I do it all over again. I feel like I'm at least 20 years older from the time I took this job, but it was well worth it. But the fact that, Secretary Geithner approved it in 2012, and here we are 4 years later. So, again, I would do it again in a heartbeat. But I do think that, Chris, you've been here 3 years in a row talking on this panel, and you have action items, which is great. But I think we all need action items, and I think we all need metrics, and we all need very, very specific individual kind of calls to action. And I think that independent leadership is not something that we nurture very much at all. I have a 15-year-old daughter. She's going to rule the world, no doubt in my mind. I have a 20-year-old son, freshman in college, and I tell him all the time, Joey, if you work hard enough, you could be Brookie's vice president. So, but I mean, again, it's he agrees. He agrees. But my point is we really haven't kind of worked backwards from where we're going to.
Yes.
So I think about, August 26, 2020, that is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote. We have 4 years, a little over 4 years, to show what we've done for the last 100. So what I'm trying to tell people is, what are you going to do in 4 years? You all have 4 years to do something really, really amazing, whether it's going back to graduate school, whether it's, whatever it is, starting a family, whether it is that promotion that you're trying to go for. But you have to work backwards. We have to really kind of tell each other and support each other and champion each other to say, whatever your goal is in 4 years, you're going to do it. And again, this talk part is so hard for me because I'm not one to just kind of talk about it. I have to own it and grab it and advance it.
Right.
And that doesn't work for everyone. But again, I think we're so used to just kind of getting the pat on the head, and as long as us women get these resource roles and these corporate jobs, we should all be happy. No. And it does take that independent, individual call to action. I just think it's time.
I have a small call to action for anyone in the room, which is...
Let's do our call to action.
Yeah, call to action is, if you have any P&L responsibility, if you have a team underneath you, people who report to you, check the pay when you split by gender. Salesforce is a great example of this. Their CEO thought that there was total gender parity. There must not be any issues there, but when they actually ran the numbers, there were. And so Ray Dalio said this yesterday, which I found so interesting, was like surrounding oneself with the question of whether or not you could be wrong, and saying just because we assume that everything is fine, the best thing you'll get from the results is great. We're actually doing great. That's a wonderful result to find, but confirming that that's actually the case would be my call to action.
That's a good one.
And Candy, have you seen any metrics that work? We talked to Janet was talking about that. There's the 30% club that Helena Morrissey does in London. So when you name a number and a target and hold people accountable to it, you tend to get some better action.
Yeah, and I think Tracy's here, who is at City and runs our City Women group, and has really, there's been a lot of focus around the metrics. Early on, there was a recognition that we needed the numbers, we needed the data, and we needed to understand it, and then we needed to work on targets. And so we started early with diverse slates, and then 30%. So we hit 30% for as a voluntary target, even for the board, and the board achieved it last 4 months ago, I think, was the selection the board members have been on, and now the focus is on that set of metrics to see if you can move the needle further to get to the full sort of 30% at the broader management level. So we started board down, and now we're trying to broaden it out. But it does work if you've got the metrics and you get the buy-in, but it also then goes to the action point, which is you've got to have the buy-in at the top, you've got to have the commitment from the CEO level and the CEO suite, and then you've got to have that collaboration and the action points. And I think it's a continual work in progress, and we're all searching, as Janet said, for what are the best practices and the best ways to achieve that. This dialogue helps us get to some of that, but I think the metrics and the focus on the numbers helps you get closer, because if you don't, then you're just gonna, you just kind of spin your wheels eventually, right. And you don't really try to achieve something because you have nothing to achieve. So you're just
Sure, and you focus on what's measured.
Right.
All right, we have a few minutes remaining. I wanted to open it up to the audience to see if there were any questions for the panel. And we have microphones, so if you just stand and raise your hand and wait a moment until they bring you a microphone, you have a question. It's difficult to see with the light, so if you're...
Yeah.
Yes, please, on there, over here.
Hey, Alex, Kate Mitchell. It's been a while. Great listening to you. Question for you and for Rosie and for all of you that are dealing with male millennials. Do you think that their conditioning and their sort of point of view in the world is better or worse? Do you think it's, and given particularly, Alex, where you sit at the Daily Muse, love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I'm both hopeful in looking at sort of men in the millennial demographic, but also hesitant to say that's all we need. I think the experience that men have growing up, whether they have sisters, whether their mother worked, a lot of that seems, from my experience, to have a big effect on when they are then in the workforce. And for the most part, because women have been entering the workforce over the last many decades, that's had a big impact. But for example, being in technology, the number of men who work at startups who have never reported to a woman ever is staggering because of the breakdown of men and women in the technology industry. So their assumptions of what women leaders might be or not be, whether women want to be leaders. I've heard from a male founder of an early stage startup tell me, I'm not really sure if women want to be engineers. I was like, why do you believe that to be the case? He goes, well, the women I worked with before don't seem to like the things or be interested in engineering. And so I asked him more, and effectively he's worked with women who have been in administrative positions, in marketing, maybe in HR. It's like, well, what that means is that marketers are not interested in engineering, and people who are in HR are not interested in engineering, but if you had ever met a female engineer, she's just as interested in engineering as you. And so that's where I get a little bit more worried, is depending on the experiences that people have very early in their career, and especially with how hot the tech sector is right now, I actually worry about the gap widening as technology sort of evolves, and these men are in positions of power where they have never seen a female leader before in their life.
And I think there should be cause for concern. I'm a trustee of an organisation called Palace Foundation, and we help about 150 young black men and women every year. And they come from the various universities, and we immerse them in a leadership course over 2 weeks in London. And over the last 3 years, what we have seen is that the number of young men coming onto our leadership program has been decreasing, and the number of women increasing, because the criteria by which you're accepted onto the course, the guys are not making it, but more women are making the grade, so to speak. However, when they're in the workplace, what we're seeing is that the attrition rate for the young women in finance, in terms of leaving within 2 years, is almost 100%. But the boys, the young guys, are there. So the message that gives to the young men is that, are my female counterparts not serious about being in finance? The messages are not positive.
Yeah.
So when you are asking questions about mentors and sponsorship, as I spend a great deal of my time talking to my individual members. So I think last year I may have spoken to maybe as many as 3,000 women. Where the difficulty comes in, it's when you have a mentor, and we don't have the luxury in the UK of having female mentors because there's so few females at the top. So most mentors tend to be men. And where women struggle, I think, is the language or the relationship that they have with their male mentors. So for us, that is an area of need that we need to focus on with our male counterparts and to really understand how best to manage that relationship, whether it's a mentoring relationship or it's a sponsorship relationship. So there's a real issue there.
Mm-hmm. Another question. Yes, you're in the front. Sorry. Wait for a mic, please.
Thank you. If you're not going to take the same path that we do in Sweden, what's the matter with quotas?
Very good. Well, look, I mean, first of all, I think there's absolutely no appetite for that ever happening in the United States. It's a fantasy. It's a totally different environment in Europe that enabled that to happen. Can you imagine even that conversation coming up here? It's hard to imagine. But I will say, look, the argument against quotas, which lots of really smart and, accomplished women will make, is that, they don't want to, they want to achieve success through their own means and not through an artificial quota. There are plenty of others who say that we'll never change if we don't enforce some kind of rules that forces a change. And just interestingly, in some of the countries around the world that have had quotas of women in their government, they've actually had extraordinary results. So Tunisia, for instance, has a constitutional requirement of representative democracy. They require that the number of women in their parliament reflect the number of women in their society. And it's been one of the more stable post-Arab Spring places in the Middle East. And there's other examples of that around the country. But, many women are uncomfortable with it. And I'll say that the challenge sometimes with the numbers targets in our businesses, too, is that there's laws of unintended consequences, which is that male leaders, and I'm now helping some companies kind of unwind this and go in a different direction, where they've had these hard targets of numbers, and so male leaders feel the pressure to promote people who may indeed not be quite ready, and the knock-on effect of that for other women is that then it creates this really bad ripple effect when they don't succeed. Everyone goes, oh, well, see, we shouldn't have done that. That was a mistake. And it was really because that person went, there's such complicated issues. I think we do have to measure, but, I like to see companies focus not just on the numbers, but on the climate and the accountability. I have an agreement with Deloitte. I do some work with Deloitte on these issues. And one of the things that Deloitte does, they hold their leaders accountable not for hitting a number, but for what they individually do to advance diversity in the organization. It's a subtle difference, but it makes a huge impact because then every leader is actually accountable for making progress of some kind. And by the way, they have hit pretty extraordinary numbers, and we're the first professional services firm in the industry to have a woman CEO. But they haven't taken the tack of we need 30%. And so, this is why this stuff is so hard.
And I think that metrics they tend to be viewed as punitive, like there's a negative consequence for not meeting the metric. But I think if you change that and realize that there's a positive outcome for meeting the metric, and the numbers prove that time and time again. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and I want everyone to get to their next session, but thank you all for coming.